Hello interwebs, I hope you're all doing well, and today we're going to be talking about something a little bit funny, just a tiny little bit funny, and that is the fact that Fox News recently posted an opinion article about my favorite franchise, Star Trek, and the article... Star Trek writers take Starship Enterprise where it's never gone before. Woke politics. Woke politics? In my Star Trek? Oh, the show that had Chief O'Brien declare he was a Union man in the same episode where Ferengi actually quote Karl Marx?
Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains.
What's happened to you?
The same franchise that had literally one of the first interracial kisses ever at a time where that was considered controversial back in the 60s? Star Trek, of all franchises, going woke. What are we exploring? Social justice worlds now?
But you cannot expect Loki and people like him to act with self-discipline any more than you can expect the planet to stop orbiting its sun.
Now, clearly, I am taking the piss out a little bit initially on this one because it is just abjectly hilarious on its face that someone would complain about woke politics in Star Trek, considering that shows and franchises a long history of very socially didactic stories and plotlines. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. But also, clearly, this is just another one of those articles feeding into the culture war conversation around pop culture and franchises today that's always saying that woke culture and SJWs and diversity hires and forced diversity are ruining our favorite franchises like Star Wars or Doctor Who or Marvel or DC without recognizing the fact or deliberately ignoring the fact that all of those things back in their day were actually socially and politically didactic, from Doctor Who also quoting Karl Marx to the early 2000s Doctor Who being also very didactic under Russell T Davies, and I'm excited to see more of him doing that again with his current series of Doctor Who, and to the fact that like Star Wars itself was like about the Viet Cong, like George Lucas clearly intended that.
The good guys are the rebels. They're using asymmetric warfare against a highly organized empire. I think we call those guys terrorists today.
They were Viet Cong.
Exactly. So were you thinking of that at the time?
Yes.
So these things have always been very politically didactic, and these sort of articles and things are always just feeding into the culture war conversation in order to stoke up people's nostalgia, in order to get them all angry and hot and bothered because of the left coming in to ruin their favorite things, using that culture war to fuel anger and things like that. And I talked about that sort of dynamic a little bit more in my video that I did on Matrix Resurrection, so you can check that out up here if you're curious for like a deeper dive into that whole dynamic. But that being said, I kind of wanted to dive deeper into this article in particular because we can actually sort of see how these narratives gets formed and how people sort of think about these things from sort of right-wing and conservative spaces that create these ideas that foster this culture war narrative without actually understanding what these works of art are trying to say and do, and then use that narrative, that sort of misconstruing of these stories to then fuel these culture war conversations. Alrighty, here's the article, and first thing I'm going to say right up front, I apologize, I don't have ad blockers, so you're going to have to deal with these pictures of chicken and QFC nonsense here. Oh god, ads. Anyways, but also I wish to point out that this is written by David Marcus, which is hilarious because that's the same name as Captain Kirk's kid from the movie, so I thought that was funny. Anyways, let's dive into the article. There is no more quintessential American story universe than Star Trek. Since its creation in 1966, the franchise has had myriad iterations on big screen and small, basically invented the sci-fi convention, and has charmed audiences across every generation. But in 2 recent episodes, writers crossed a line where no Star Trek has gone before. That is to say, they got directly involved in partisan politics. Alright, so he's complaining about partisan politics in Star Trek. We'll talk about that in a second, but let's talk about what his specific examples are and what he's very upset about. So he says, the first blatant example of electioneering on Star Trek Discovery was a cameo by current and former Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams as none other than the president of the Federation of Planets. So first off, we can already tell right by that sentence that this writer either didn't watch the episode or didn't pay attention to the episode, because Stacey Abrams was not the president of the Federation of Planets. That was actually this character, President Rylak, who appeared in pretty much every episode or close to every episode of season 4 of Star Trek Discovery. Who Stacey Abrams was playing was the president of Earth, which actually, as we saw in season 3, was a very nationalistic, very self-centered government that that has just started to open itself up and is considering joining the Federation in season 4, which was the cameo by Stacey Abrams. So already we can see that this writer did not pay attention or did not even watch the episodes and is just sort of here to complain about stuff that he really hasn't watched or seen. But then he goes on to say the second was a weird plot twist in the pilot of the new show, Finish. Can someone do like a copyright session on this thing, by the way? Strange New Worlds, in which the 2020 Capitol riot is depicted and blamed for starting a second American Civil War and the destruction of the planet. To put it more succinctly, Orange Man bad. So what this guy is talking about is this scene from Star Trek Strange New Worlds.
This is Earth in our 21st century.
Before everything went wrong. It's a lot like your world today.
Recently, I was treated to a glimpse of my future. It was not all I'd hoped. After all, what good is there in knowing your future? A friend of mine asked me that recently and didn't understand what he meant. Until now. I've seen my future. Let me show you yours. Our conflict also started with a fight for freedoms. We called it the Second Civil War, then the Eugenics War, and finally, just World War III. This was our last day. The day the Earth we knew ceased to exist. What began as an eruption in one nation ended in the eradication of 600,000 species of animals and plants and 30% of Earth's population. Global suicide. What we gave you is the means to exterminate yourselves. And from the looks of you, you're gonna do it. You'll use competing ideas of liberty to bomb each other to rubble just like we did. And then your last day will look just like this. Perhaps somewhere all your ends are written as indelibly as mine. But I choose to believe that your destinies are still your own.
Now, I'll try and keep this as spoiler-free as possible for the show if you have not seen it yet, but basically that is in a sequence by Captain Pike, the lead character on the show, who is using Earth's history in this moment, leaning into things from actual Star Trek lore, by the way. World War III and the Eugenics Wars are both things that appeared in Star Trek lore way, way, way back in, like, the original series. It's not just something made up in whole cloth for Strange New Worlds. And using this history of, like, people having destroyed themselves on Earth and trying to head that off for another alien planet, saying this is the path that you're going down if you are going to constantly be fighting and bickering and targeting and yelling at each other. Which, by the way, kind of goes against what this guy is saying when it's like partisan politics. Like, that episode's clearly like showing two sides fighting and attacking each other, and the episode's message is to de-escalate from that to avoid this type of violence. So already we see this writer is kind of like missing the point of what these things are saying or doing. To be fair, since the original 1960s series, Star Trek has always delved into cultural and societal issues. It has always been credited with diverse casts with tackling issues like saving the whales. Remember that? Yes, we all remember the one with the whales. Come on, who do you think we are?
Admiral, there be whales here!
And with reflecting American and global foreign policy. All that should live long and prosper, but these two recent incidents go a good deal further. This isn't issue advocacy, it's pure partisan politics. This argument is, on its face, correct. But what he's sort of implying here is that these depictions within past Star Trek were that they had a sort of centrist point of view, that they were sort of like presenting the sides of something and not really like coming out with one side or the other, just sort of presenting them and talking about them, that they were sort of like in the middle, which has never been the case for Star Trek. I mean, going back to the original series, you had things like the interracial kiss between Kirk and Uhura. And while not as overly controversial as sometimes people like to portray it, I mean, it wasn't even the first actual interracial kiss on television. Actually, William Shatner himself did that a few years before Star Trek in a different show. But it was a very clearly partisan message, given that at the time, black civil rights issues were like the heated debate, and were a very partisan issue. On top of that, you had episodes like A Private Little War, which talked about the Vietnam War.
What is your sober, sensible solution to all this?
I don't have a solution, but furnishing them firearms is certainly not the answer.
Bones, do you remember the 20th century brush wars on the Asian continent? Two giant powers involved, much like the Klingons and ourselves. Neither side felt that they could pull out.
Yes, I remember. It went on bloody year after bloody year.
It's very clearly talking about brush wars and things like that within that episode and making a very clear stance on that episode. There's even an episode within the original series where Kirk literally cites the Constitution of the United States in a very blatantly didactic message and saying that it needs to apply to everyone.
Tall words, proudly saying, "We the people." That what you call id plebnista was not written for the chiefs or the kings or the warriors or the rich or the powerful, but for all the people. Down the centuries, you have slurred the meaning out of the words, "We the people of the United States."
And again, this is at the time where, like, this was clearly very targetedly focused on civil rights issues. But even if we go even further, like I joked about earlier, like Deep Space Nine had episodes where characters literally form a union and quote Karl Marx.
We're all on strike.
Star Trek, throughout its entire 60-year history, has never been centrist. It has never been sort of in the middle on its politics. Whether you like it or not, that has been the message of Star Trek. And even in these two examples that he is pointing out, again, he's clearly missed the actual intention of what they're meaning, but even if you look at something like Stacey Abrams appearing in the show, part of the reason that Stacey Abrams is appearing in the show is not necessarily like an example of electioneering, trying to like get Stacey Abrams elected. Part of it was because the fact that Stacey Abrams herself is a huge Star Trek fan. She's been no bones about that she is a big Star Trek fan, so like her cameo has pretty much nothing to do with like the politics of the storyline being told. It is taking a famous person from Star Trek fandom and having her get a chance to cameo in the show. Now, obviously, Stacey Abrams is a very noted and very wonderful, in my opinion, advocate for voting rights in Georgia. She has become a heated talking point by right-wing and conservative groups to attack her and devalue her. Tucker Carlson, for example, on Fox News itself has done numerous attacks on her, and there's even been studies that have shown that Tucker Carlson, by the way, consistently goes after black women. There was actually a recent article that like did a whole study of Tucker Carlson's stuff and that showed that he had very clearly targets black women in that way. So clearly she is a political figure that the right-wing conservative movements have targeted. And by no means am I implying that like her casting is apolitical by any means. Like clearly there is a choice by the writers of the show to put this very controversial in the sense that like right-wing people are attacking her, not controversial in the sense that like she's fighting for very needed rights like voting rights. They're clearly making a statement. And also very similar with Strange New Worlds, using stock footage of the Capitol coup in 2020 to imply that that helps lead to a second American Civil War, to World War III and things like that, and sort of leads to this catharsis moment for humanity after a lot of death to like lead into that future of Star Trek. It's very clearly tying to moments of today into these messages. And so that idea of like making very clear that we are talking about like these issues today within modern Star Trek, like these specific issues, is a slightly new tactic compared to older Star Trek. But in my mind, I think it's actually a very important and somewhat needed one for Star Trek, because part of the reason that we see so many fans like David Marcus here not understand the messages of Star Trek as a very not centrist argument is the fact that it was all shrouded in metaphor, alien metaphor. And while I do think that that is an important part of why I love Star Trek, it allows people to move past their biases and actually just see these things from a sort of distance point of view, that does allow people to miss when these things are talking about these direct issues. When, like, for example, we talk about like queer issues in a queer allegory way in Star Trek, when you have that coded in alien metaphor, it allows people to only see it within that alien metaphor and not necessarily see how it applies to real people today. Or when they see it applied to real people today, they don't understand how otherizing that can still be. When you see queer people as just aliens and queer issues as just alien, it still otherizes us. And so when you take these things like Star Trek Discovery has done in a lot of its cases, where it talks about like issues relating to body and gender stuff, but also including trans people literally in the actual like text of the show, like saying this character is trans. Also we'll talk about alien metaphor, gender body stuff with like the Trill and things. By having us included in that, it allows you to not miss it, not allow you to look away from it, not allow you to see these things for what they are.
Transitioning, it's like I had bigger things to think about, but if I get another chance to remake my body, then why not get rid of all the things that aren't totally me?
And I think that, unfortunately, in today's media, we need that more than ever. Because if you look at past Star Treks, people miss that. People miss these messages, and how they could take it as a centrist message is partially because of these facts that it was shrouded in metaphor. And while I think Star Trek should continue to tell metaphorical stories, like Strange New Worlds, like Discovery are doing, to take these moments to be very clear of like, no, this is about today, to make that pointed statement, I think is somewhat needed today in an era where sometimes subtlety is sadly lost on a lot of people or is intentionally missed by a lot of people. But even further, I want to go further into this article a little bit more to talk about this further. Because he goes on to say this. This is part of a broader galaxy of problems that we saw recently with Disney, who owns Star Wars, going to battle with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. The central confusion here is the difference between showing broad support for things like basic civil rights and openly advocating for one political party's answer for securing them. When you talk about basic civil rights issues, when we have parties like the GOP literally attacking basic civil rights of trans people, people of color, and things like that, they aren't centrist issues. You can't just like say broad, like vague support for civil issues in today where these issues are so being directly partisan. But even further, this idea that like is talking about like the woke Disney agenda kind of misses what happened with Disney in general. Disney, through various different corporations and entities that it controls, gave money to two of the people who wrote the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. Disney actually supported Republican partisan politics in those states. Not directly the Don't Say Gay bill, but to the people who helped push it. Then, after a huge amount of pushback from outside and within the company, and after like a lot of hesitance by the current CEO of Disney, finally Disney like denounced the Don't Say Gay bill and sort of asked Florida not to pass it. They ultimately did not passing it, and now DeSantis is the one engaging in very clear targeted politics against Disney by trying to take away a lot of their sort of allowances that have been given under the Florida like tax breaks and things. So it sort of misunderstands that like Disney was only doing these things because of intense pushback from people, and also the fact that DeSantis is the one that's currently engaging in those partisan politics as well as the fact that like Disney has never been like a great ally. They are the ones doing the forced diversity, sort of like very clearly, like very thinly veneered representation of minorities, of minority issues and things like that. Oh, we'll have a bisexual character in one single line that we can cut out for international markets.
Must have been would-be princesses. Or perhaps another prince.
A bit of both.
Disney is just doing those things superficially, whereas Star Trek is actually being very clear and didactic in what it's saying. It's kind of a different deal going on there. But he keeps on misunderstanding the point here, right? Because he goes and says, so, for example, almost everyone supports voting rights, but that isn't the same as supporting Stacey Abrams. Almost everyone condemns the Capitol riot and political violence, but that's not the same in placing unique blame on one single event for one side of the spectrum. Well, my dude, there is a clear party that is against voting rights right now, that is attacking and pushing down voting rights. And yes, they will obfuscate it and saying like, oh, there's voter fraud and we want to secure that. Like, that's what the GOP says. They are clearly doing this to try to infringe on the rights of many marginalized people so they can keep their minority rule stronger. So clearly not everyone supports voting rights. Supporting voting rights is a partisan thing right now, because of how far right the GOP has gone. And honestly, the Democrats not even doing enough to fight for voting rights, Stacey Abrams being one of the few. Hence why having her in the show is an important statement on those rights, not just saying like blanket Democrat Party. Like, Stacey Abrams is one of the few people on the ground doing that fight and that work. And the same thing with the Capitol coup. That wasn't a bipartisan thing. It wasn't like both sides of the political spectrum. That was clearly stoked by Trump and other people in the GOP to try to have an actual coup for Trump. That's what that was. And again, it's a partisan issue because we've seen many people in the GOP not denounce what happened there, and in fact enabled a lot of it. So again, this idea that these are centrist issues that you can kind of keep in shrouded metaphor doesn't stand up to water. It's not a centrist issue. Star Trek is not being centrist. And that's ultimately what these people are trying to argue, that these issues are somehow centrist issues when they literally cannot be, based on how much the GOP has politicized them. And so by arguing this with Star Trek, it just goes to show how blatantly they're trying to gaslight and obfuscate the fact that these are very important issues that we need to be talking about. And it's not the people who are fighting for basic rights that are the ones that are making it political. And he keeps going, ultimately, the problem here is that this kind of political signaling is alienating for those fans who are not part of the Democratic Party political tribe. As a fan myself, it hasn't made me turn off the shows, but it's jarring and also breaks the narrative spell of fantasy and science fiction, which is why people tune in the first place. So again, this goes into what many of these people are arguing that these shows should be, that they should simply be escapism. And I'm not knocking the fact that if you watch Star Trek, and I sometimes watch Star Trek for this, to just have a fun hour of television and to just get lost in the science fiction universe of it all, that's 100% valid. But to argue that like Star Trek didn't have a side, I think is missing what Star Trek was trying to say. And it's never been about just trying to appeal to everyone. Like, hopefully Star Trek messages are shrouded in a way that allow, like, more people to understand and get in and, like, see the issues. But to say that Star Trek wasn't alienating to people in any way, shape, or form, I think misses a lot of what Star Trek was. It feels very much like the writers and creators of the new line of Star Trek shows, which also includes Picard, don't think just writing a good TV show is important enough work. Like so much of corporate America, they think they have to save the country and the planet while doing it, leave the planet saving for the fictional Starship Enterprise. His statement about save the planet saving for the fictional Starship Enterprise is incredibly revealing, because it showcases how he doesn't want to have to face the fact that Star Trek is all about making a message about how to fight for a better future of humanity and how that can be achieved, by fighting for everyone's basic liberties. It again goes to why moments like Stacey Abrams' cameo or the moment in Strange New Worlds are so important, because it forces those who wish to ignore Star Trek's messages and its relevances to today to look directly at what Star Trek is saying. Star Trek is not about saving other fictional planets. Its intention from its inception was about trying to save our own world today. The whole point of Star Trek was to try to fight for a better world. Gene Roddenberry himself, like, I have issues with the man and, like, I don't always love his writing and things like that, but Gene Roddenberry, in terms of, like, his fight for progressive issues, was correct. And he always fought for things like diversity, like his speech about the humanity needs to find delight in the differences of life forms and in ourselves before we have any right to go to the stars. That's what his message was with Star Trek. And that is about making the world better. If we're talking about Picard, by the way, I will admit that I did not love season 2 of Star Trek Picard. I did a whole video on it that you can check out. But I will say, like, I really appreciated within that season, while I did not love how it was necessarily written, they did have a character played by Brent Spiner who was an Elon Musk-esque figure, who the show very clearly pointed out was part of leading to a fascist future that we see in that season.
You're currently at a fork in the proverbial road. Two futures. One leads to you bringing humanity back from the edge of extinction. They will call you the father of the future. Your statues will grace capitals. Or you die alone. No glory. Forgotten in a pool of your own 90-proof vomit.
That season at least tried to have this discussion about how the very real income gap that we have in the United States is part of what possibly might lead us to a darker future, because we don't try to help everyone. Like, that's what that season was partially about.
Wonderful ambassador up against the backdrop of hope meets hopelessness. You're killing it, 2024. You know, I've never been able to understand how a society could exist with so many contradictions and not collapse sooner than it did.
And it also directly cited the Bell riots within that season of Star Trek Picard, which is a Deep Space Nine storyline, which also talked about this same issue, about how we dispossess people and place people in homeless camps and sort of shove them off to society and dispossess them, leading to violence.
One of the main complaints against the sanctuary districts was overcrowding. It got to the point where they didn't care how many people were in here. They just wanted to keep them out of sight.
And once they were out of sight, what then? I mean, look at this man. There's no need for him to live like that. With the right medication, he could lead a full and normal life.
Maybe in our time.
Not just in our time. There are any number of effective treatments for schizophrenia, even in this day and age. They could cure that man now, today, if they gave a damn.
The Bell riots themselves are the same things that were being shown in Strange New Worlds, and it was very didactic. Yes, shrouded slightly in metaphor, but it was in San Francisco, just a few years ahead of where Deep Space Nine was. It was a very clearly stating this type of dispossessing people will lead to violence, and ultimately may lead to greater change. It's not saying violence is never the answer. A very not centrist message about, like, these people being dispossessed and displaced. And Picard, season 2, regardless of how well the writing was, tried to say those exact things. The irony here is that all 3 Star Trek live-action shows are quite progressive in the diversity of their casting. Yes, Star Trek Discovery, Strange New Worlds, and even Picard are all very diverse in their casting. Lower Decks as well, and Prodigy as well. Like, fantastic across the board, but it's not just tokenistic diversity that we need to check boxes with Star Trek shows, and it's about including those people in the conversations, which I think, of all the shows, Discovery is doing best, but I think all of these shows are doing that to some degree or another, but not just, like, checking the boxes of diversity casting, because that's what the original series did. As much as I love Nichelle Nichols, as much as I love George Takei, they they were just castings that were kind of just checking the box of diversity and weren't really included in the story of the shows as often as they should have, which is finally being corrected with things like Strange New Worlds, by the way, with Celia Gooding, who is non-binary, by the way, playing Uhura, and that character finally getting more backstory in a single episode of that show than we got for the entirety of Uhura in her entire series.
I moved in with my grandmother, but I just didn't feel like I fit anywhere. Anyway, she was in Starfleet when she was young, and she always used to talk about it, and well, I didn't know what else to do.
Nothing against Nichelle Nichols, fantastic actor. She did a great job in that role, and her importance as Nichelle Nichols was inspiring to so many. But on the level of just that character being included in the stories and getting to have backstory and being part of the main driving thrust of the plot, not always the case, especially in the original show. So it's not just about diversity, it's about being inclusive with the storytelling when who you get to include in those stories. And that is, by the way, a political thing. Because he completely misses the point where he says, despite hysterical concerns about backlash, that never actually happens. I don't know where he's not getting that, because if you look at every time a diverse casting hire happens in Star Trek, whether it be transgender characters in Star Trek, whether it be Sonequa Martin Green is the first black woman lead character of a Star Trek show, whether it be literally the fact that they cast a black man in the role of a side character that originally appeared in Star Trek the animated series, this backlash happens literally all the time. And it's before these shows even come out, so we don't even know how these characters will be written, included, or anything like that. So it shows how just identities, just diversity of casting is itself not a centrist issue. So this is just a completely either ignorant or completely misframing it. And I would say that it's got to be intentionally misframing it, because there's no way you can talk about these shows nowadays and not understanding that there's always some sort of woke SJW black backlash to any type of casting of someone who is not a straight white cisgender man. Perhaps what America lacks more than anything today is a shared set of strong stories that help explain our world. Even our entertainment is awash in bitter partisanship. It leaves America too few places to ponder their lives and communities outside the context of red versus blue. Star Trek is one of the small handfuls of entertainment brands with popularity, scope, and reach to be that shared story, but to do so, its creators must choose that universality over scoring cheap, predictable, and partisan political points. Well, I hope I made the argument that these weren't cheap, predictable, and partisan political points, but the goal of these things weren't necessarily to just say, vote Democrat, but to actually say, something about today's issues, to actually talk about today's issues. And unfortunately, in our very didactic political world, these are partisan issues. People's basic human rights, people's basic rights and voting rights are very partisan, real issues that you cannot say are something to be centrist or something to just sort of leave in alien metaphor. And also, by the way, I want to make very clear, too, that I've been using the terms partisan and centrist to discuss these issues to kind of make it very clear. But even that is sort of a misframing of this whole debate, because honestly, the Democrats aren't really fighting for these issues as well. In some ways, sometimes doing nothing at all to try and stop these things, and sometimes even enabling the GOP or just sort of standing by and watching things happen. So it's not even really a quote-unquote partisan issue in terms of red versus blue, but a literal fight for basic people's rights that the GOP is pushing and Democrats are often enabling. And so to argue that this is a partisan issue in Star Trek misses that the reason that Star Trek feels so political is simply because it's trying to show us a better world and speak about issues of today. It's not partisan. It's just actually talking about basic human rights. All of these things that current Star Trek is doing, whether we could argue about the writing of it or not, I personally like Discovery, Strange New Worlds, less so on Picard, but Lower Decks and Prodigy I also love. This stuff is very clearly in line with everything Star Trek has tried to be. And I think by the very fact that Strange New Worlds and Discovery are making people upset on these bases kind of shows to me that Star Trek is doing the right thing. That it should make people upset. Current day Star Trek should make people bothered by its message. It should discomfort the comfortable and comfort the discomforted. And that's what I think Star Trek is doing. And I am so proud of this franchise in that aspect. I am so proud to be a fan of this franchise because it is the franchise that is pushing these things harder than probably any other franchise out there. Do I think that Star Trek is the best at these messages all the time, every time? No. It is a franchise made by big corporations and stuff like that. And so I totally understand there are issues to be had with it on many different levels. I even have my own critiques, as I've tried to be very clear with on this channel. For example, in that exact scene from Strange New Worlds that this guy is complaining about, I actually have a problem with that scene because its message of de-escalating both sides and directly paralleling that to our modern day political disagreements in the United States misses that often one side, like the GOP, as the Fox News article shows, often has a vested financial and power interest in continuing escalating conflicts and obfuscating who is actually causing the problem, like this Fox News article is doing. And so honestly, my issue issue with that scene in Strange New Worlds is not that it was too woke, but while I love the show, I think it actually could go further and was not, quote, woke enough, honestly, in my mind. But that being said, I still really love Strange New Worlds and like this scene because of its idealistic message that it's trying to portray. But on these things, I think this is in the grand tradition of Star Trek. And I think this article, while we can make fun of it, I think that to just laugh at it, well, worth laughing at, I think we should also just look at how these people think about these things and how they are able to miss the important messages of things like Star Trek because they aren't asked to be forced to look at it. And I'm really pleased that things like this force them to reconcile with their beliefs. And also, just to wrap this out, just to get one last little laugh out of here, we do see that Robert Hewitt Wolf, who was a writer on Star Trek Deep Space Nine, said, "Actual Star Trek writer, you're a moron." You can quote me on that, writing about Fox News. And even George Takei, who wants to tell him with this article. So even people who work on Star Trek, from the original series to Deep Space Nine, to obviously the people on current Trek, are kind of like, okay, you're being kind of silly and you missed the point. But anyways, thank you so much for joining me on this video. I just had to explore that article because I found it kind of illuminating and funny, but also illuminating. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. But that being said, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I have some great videos coming up soon. I literally, today, just finished a pass on Sex and Star Trek Part 2. It is almost done. It should be coming next month. Very excited for that. I also have some great videos coming up about some issues on gender critical feminists on Friday. Very excited for that video. Check that out. And then I also have a James Gunn video diving into the discussions of masculinity and toxic masculinity within James Gunn's filmography coming as well. So very excited about all those videos coming. But beyond that, thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you, as always, my friends, live long and prosper.